I'll just briefly. Good evening, everyone. Okay, we're just going to start now. With us tonight is Professor Paul Midford. Okay, he's going to give us a talk on his new book, Rethinking Japanese Public Opinion and Security. So I'm not going to talk too much. So Paul, I'm Matthew Lindley. I'm also an assistant professor here at Temple University. So we'll have time for Paul's lecture and then for some questions afterwards. Yeah. Okay. Please have a seat. It's yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I have to say this is actually the second talk on this topic. I just came back from Odawara where I taught at Tokai University, so it might be a little bit slightly coarser than usual, but hopefully I'll still be understandable. So as Matthew was saying, this is based more or less on my new book, particularly Chapter 9, which kind of looks at public opinion in Japan after the Iraq deployment. Also, I have some important updates from that. I look at particularly the reaction to the Senkaku fishing ship incident last fall. I also have some data from 2009 about missile defense. And also I talk a bit about how things have changed under the DPJ government. So, the question I'm kind of asking or engaging is this observation we saw a lot of over the last 10 years, particularly during the Koizumi administration, the Abe administration. Namely, is Japan emerging as a normal military power? Now, one key question about that, of course, is what is a normal military power in Japan's case? That's often not seriously addressed by this literature. Which is one of the points I'm going to come back to. We have the 2002 year 2000 Armitage Report. Japan is to emerge as the Britain of Asia, a country willing to fight alongside U.S. military forces in global conflicts far from Afghanistan, far from Japan, such as Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. This is a quote from a colleague, Ellis Krauss, many of you know him, at the University of California, basically saying, thanks to Koizumi's success in deploying the SDF to Iraq, now collective defense is on the table. The right to collective defense, Shudankeki Jiaken, meaning that Japan could now reinterpret its constitution to allow its forces to fight alongside U.S. forces in places, again, like Afghanistan or Iraq. And this is just a quote from a very good political scientist and observer of Japan at the RAND Corporation, Eric Higginbotham. Again, the point is the same. More SDF deployments overseas, greater range of activities that begin to approach, if not exceed, move into actual use of force overseas. I think this is really kind of the main question about the normal military power debate. Now there's the other side, which is Japan playing a bigger role in its own national defense, which I will get to in a moment. But this, I think, is the most controversial part of the debate. Now, the main hypotheses I'd like to present tonight are first, that public opinion, and incidentally, let me just stop for a second and say, sometimes I've noticed people say I talk a little too fast. So if I do, raise your hand, or at ICU last fall when I was talking, the translators started flailing their hands wildly, and I should be able to slow down, I think. But public opinion, this is my first hypothesis, my main one, prevents Japan from assuming an overseas military role, particularly one that involves the use of force. Now this is different from saying that public opinion prevents the SDF from going overseas. We know they go overseas, but they go overseas for non-combat, humanitarian, disaster relief type operations, reconstruction operations, maybe even to participate in helping to disperse ODA and help with development projects. But that's does not involve the use of force, and generally involves missions that do not appear to involve kind of traditional military roles. In other words, Japan, the SDF much of what it does overseas in these deployments is similar to, is very similar to its most popular role domestically, namely disaster relief and reconstruction. And underlying public opinion, I would argue, is attitudinal defense of realism. Japanese public opinion views military force as having utility for homeland defense, as you can see here, territorial defense, but not really for much else. So the public, that's the limit. So in other words, they don't see offensive military powers having utility for promoting democracy or human rights, suppressing terrorism, suppressing WMD proliferation. They just don't think it is useful for those purposes. Now, the Koizumi syndrome is another hypothesis, and my argument here is that Koizumi overreached the domestic consensus, the public opinion consensus regarding the acceptable limits of SDF overseas deployments, and thereby created a backlash in public opinion, reducing support for other kinds of overseas deployments, and helping to undermine support for revision of the Constitution, revision of Article 9. The public has overwhelmingly and persistently opposed the SDF using force overseas, as I just alluded to. And in fact, one thing I noticed as I was finishing this book that hadn't really dawned on me before, and I noted in the book, is that actually the majority that is opposed to the SDF using force overseas is essentially as large as the majority opposed to Japan acquiring nuclear weapons. It's in excess of 80% in those polls, with those supporting the military engaging in combat overseas at like 10 to 15% usually. The Iraq War syndrome, this is similar to the Koizumi syndrome, but this refers more to fear of entrapment. Fear of entrapment in terms of, let me just explain what that means. International political theory, we talk about the alliance dilemma. When you're in an alliance with another country, you have two things you have to worry about. One is when a war comes, your ally abandons you. The other is that they entrap you in a war that's not in your own interest. And here in Iraq, very much like the Vietnam War 30 years before, stoked this fear of Japan being sucked into a war that it didn't see, that the public didn't see as having much utility, being in Japan's interest, and hence we saw the public becoming more cautious about the alliance, which is different from opposing the alliance, but more cautious about what could be done with the U.S., and more cautious about overseas deployments in general. Priorities. The Japanese public in recent years has been willing to punish and vote retrospectively against leaders who appear to be prioritizing Japan's international security rule or the dispatch of the SDF overseas over domestic priorities, things that they care about, such as pension reform, dealing with issues related to the aging of society, growing economic inequality in society, those sorts of issues. Again, pension reform and in particular is a concern because many Japanese worry that the pension system will fail. So when leaders have appeared to ignore or make those a secondary priority and focus on overseas military deployments, they've been punished repeatedly. Now the competing hypothesis, what I'm arguing against, is that the Japanese public always provides ex post facto support for all incremental fait accompli expansions of the SDF's military role overseas, regardless of the nature of the deployment. So whatever the Japanese government decides, the public will ratify it after the fact. And this is an argument that I frequently have encountered. So with these main hypotheses, let's move on. And I want to say a little bit about two kind of approaches to public opinion, kind of theoretical approaches that are common in the U.S. So this is these are approaches derived from the study of American public opinion. And I'm applying them to Japan. I think they are highly relevant to Japan. On the other hand, you should keep in mind that this is kind of borrowing a theory from one country and using it somewhere else. And that can, of course, although I think they work pretty well, one can, of course, ask about ways in which it is applicable or not applicable, and also how the theory might develop more as it's applied to Japan. And it may even produce new insights. There's this elitist approach, as you can see here, which basically, and this is also known as the Ullmann-Lippmann consensus, that kind of formed in the 1920s when Walter Lippmann wrote about a book about public opinion, 2 famous books, and continued until the 1960s when it was challenged by the Vietnam War. And this elitist view basically says public opinion is uninformed, it's unstable, composed of non-attitudes, it's moldable, and fortunately, ultimately ignorable in their view. And in this view, politicians should be guardians of the public. They should not listen to the public, but do what they think is in the public's best interest. Now, in comparison, the pluralist approach, which really arose in the 1960s, sees, first of all, notice, this is talking about collective public opinion. This is talking about public opinion. Researchers in this tradition tended in the early 1960s, some of the pioneers in kind of serious, careful research of public opinion, went out and interviewed individuals and found that individuals' views were unstable and changed over time. But what the pluralist approach finds is that that instability cancels out at the collective level. And the point is that individuals, their views might change over time, partly due to new information, mistakes, errors in filling out surveys, etc. So you can have some short-term instability, but those kinds of cognitive errors, when you aggregate public opinion, they tend to cancel out. So collective public opinion is more than the sum of its parts. It is more stable, more coherent, not easily moldable or ignorable. It does change, of course. Saying it's stable is different than saying it's unchanging. If it were unchanging, you would have to question its the kind of coherence or rationality. But for example, if you look in the last 3 months, the Asahi poll on a different topic, nuclear power, we've seen support for using nuclear power go from 50% to 42% to 37%. So we're seeing big change in Japanese public opinion on that right now, but that's understandable. It's in response to external stimuli, receiving lots of new information about how safe nuclear power is, and the public is reacting to that. But that's different from saying it's unstable, that it changes a lot. I'll give you some other reasons why it sometimes appears to be unstable later. And according to the pluralists, then politicians need to be representatives of public opinion. Now, down here I kind of added my bit, which I talk about in the book, which is, these are 2 very stark choices. Listen to the public, don't listen to the public, right? And they're too extreme. So there should be a more sensible middle. And my basic argument is, yes, in the short run, particularly when you have a crisis, elites do have to lead. They can't, right after 9/11 or right after the earthquake, take an opinion poll and hear what the public says. And also they may have particular views, information, perspectives they want to educate the public about. So politicians often talk about educating public opinion. So in the short run, that makes sense. But in the longer run, I would argue they should then be responsive. Okay, they educated the public, they shared their knowledge, they presented their view, and the public will decide if it is convinced or not. And if it's not convinced, then politicians should take that seriously. That's kind of my normative point here about this. Now, has Japanese public opinion ever been pacifist? This is actually something I addressed in chapter 4 of my book. Has it ever really been pacifist? This has certainly been the common view, and of course it was embodied in the Socialist Party's mantra of the Cold War, unarmed neutrality. But I would argue that socialist elites were largely isolated from public opinion in making that argument, even from many of their own voters. Public opinion, and therefore, as I argue, it was really not pacifist, because very few Japanese actually thought Japan should have no military. However, many distrusted the SDF. They thought it was a creature of kishi and right-wing politicians, and that it might be a threat to post-war democracy and reforms. They also distrusted some politicians on the right, most notably Kishi, others perhaps as well. But real pacifism, Japan doesn't need to have a military and can trust other nations and war can actually be done away with. That's a relatively small element, 10 to 15% of the population in Japan. And in that sense, Japan is a normal Western democracy. You can find pacifists in every country, even in the United States. I think many people outside the United States might be a bit surprised by that, but they exist there, and they're probably about the same proportion, actually. Anti-militarist distrust of the state's ability to wield the sword, I would argue, was a far more important opinion. Now here, I'm, of course, borrowing heavily from Thomas Berger's work on Japan's culture of anti-militarism. I basically have the same view, except I'm not thinking about this as a culture so much as kind of cognitive distrust of the state, cognitive distrust of civilian control, more above all. Now, so what was often labeled as pacifism then was in fact, first of all, anti-militarist distrust of the state and the SDF initially, rather than the belief that Japan needed no army. Many people who were opposed to the SDF nonetheless wanted Japan to have some other kind of army that they would consider more trustworthy. Also, many opinions were actually consistent with realism. By the way, some of these points I should also, besides noting Thomas Berger, also note another intellectual den, which is Izumikawa, Professor Izumikawa at Chuo University, who just published an article on international security last fall that makes some of these points. Now, so in terms of ideas that were consistent with realism, one is fear of entrapment in American wars. That is very much a kind of realist fear, and you can see it if you look at diplomatic history. You know, the beginning of World War I, France did not want to be dragged into a war with Germany by Russia, because Russia was, and of course you had what was going on in the Balkans. So you had fear of entrapment by a number of countries in 1914, not because they suddenly went pacifist, but because they didn't want to get involved in a war if they could avoid it that was not in their national interest. Also, recognition that hawkish policies risk provoking others. This is also reasonably consistent with realism as well. Namely that if you're too aggressive, if you arm too much, you may provoke others to see you as a threat. This is the classic security dilemma. However, it's also true that the Japanese public did not really see the other side of the coin as much, which is that you also have to maintain deterrence capability to deter North Korea from sending ships into Japanese waters, etc. So in that sense, you could say the Japanese public opinion did diverge from what realism would expect, but I would call that more of a divergence in terms of emphasis and balance. I would not call that pacifism, which I would, as I say, define as the belief that Japan can be unarmed and exist in an unarmed state. Public attitudes, measurable opinion, and outcomes. This is just kind of my flow chart here. So the main kind of important independent variable I'm emphasizing here then are public attitudes about security. So and by the way, attitudes are kind of these relatively changing fundamental views that are kind of well structured in people's minds, and from which are derived specific opinions on specific policies. So here I argue that there, in terms of security, in terms of Japan's security, I see two fundamental attitudes. One is trust in the state's ability to control the military, or not control it, and trust in the military itself. And then the utility of military force. Does military force have utility for national defense, for foreign policy goals overseas, etc.? Now, elites try to influence public attitudes toward, but this is kind of modulated or mediated by real-world developments. Wars break out, North Korea tests a new missile, etc. And the Soviet Union collapses, etc. And so elites try to influence the public's attitudes in ways that they want them to be influenced. But of course, real-world developments also impose constraints on them. But in any case, attitudes towards security then lead to policy opinions on various things like, should we send the SDF overseas? Should we have missile defense? Etc. Should we raise the defense budget? And that leads to measurable opinion. Now, measurable opinion is different because you need a survey to find out. There are many opinions that go unmeasured. The opinions are out there, but nobody really knows about them. For example, Asahi Shimbun's poll 2 days ago started asking about renewable energy for the first time and got some very interesting results, but until you measure that and publish it and people know about it, it's kind of a latent, unmeasured opinion. Survey wording makes a big difference. I'll give some examples later. Some people argue that different media organizations like Asahi and Yomiuri may actually somehow bias may kind of fix the results in some way in terms of the sampling rates and that sort of thing. I don't really see a lot of evidence of that. What I see is mostly they kind of try to get the results they're looking for sometimes by the use of changing the question wording. And the most important thing to remember about public opinion and polling is people answer the question you ask. So whenever you look at a poll, or a poll result, it's always important to go back and look at the actual question that is asked if you want to seriously understand it. And also keep that in mind. Often one question will be asked that seems to imply one thing to the survey tape, to the respondent, but then it can be presented in a very different light later. And then finally, policy outcomes. So public attitudes and how they influence policy outcomes. Now, of course, elites have direct influence on policy outcomes as well. And measurable opinion in turn influences elites. They have to pay attention to what measurable public opinion, particularly politicians who want to be reelected. And also, I did mention this before, public attitudes towards security are also mediated by their perceptions of the U.S., U.S. use of military force, for example, and how that influences, and that in turn influences their opinions on Japanese policy. Now, here are just some kind of battles regarding overseas deployments of the SDF. And here we have, on this axis, we have the utility of offensive military power. Here we have the utility of defensive military power. And here at 0 is pacifism. And my argument is, of course, hawkish elites try to push policies out as far away from here as possible and out here, but they face the constraint of what I call these public opinion, the public's indifferent slopes regarding security. So inside this area, they are supportive of various policy proposals, but outside of it, they're not. Now, during the Cold War, it was something like this. And by the way, this is just a basic, to give you a basic image of the battles over security, over dispatching the SDF overseas in particular. I don't mean to say that you can precisely measure where these points are. This is just for illustration. And my argument is that after the end of the Cold War, Japan became, and actually gradually during, but certainly by the end of the Cold War, the Japanese public had become much more accepting of the utility of defensive military power. In effect, you had this kind of overlay of anti-militarist distrust of the state and the SDF. Over the Cold War, that gradually declined, and as it receded, what we saw underneath, I would argue, are these defensive realist attitudes about the utility of military force. And here you can see various missions. The 2004 post-tsunami dispatch is one that was very well supported by the public, so much so it became the first overseas deployment that the Japan Communist Party supported. So that's a sure sign. It's well within the broad consensus of the public. Then we have some other ones. The bill to send the SDF to to Saudi Arabia during the first Gulf crisis, Operation Desert Shield, which failed due to large public opposition, 60% and more in many polls. Then in the fall of 1991, you had a peacekeeping operations bill that was proposed that would send the SDF overseas as a unit for the first time to participate in peacekeeping. That involved too many provisions that appeared to approach the use of force, or in general had appeared to involve traditional military operations. That also was not well supported by the public. That was also rejected. But then in the spring of 1992, you get a bill that is more watered down to meet the objections of the public, and that one passes. Now, I'm glossing over a lot of the details there. I'm happy to talk about those cases more in Q&A if you're interested. So in effect, you had these three proposals, and the public opposition gradually influenced the elites to kind of move the bill more towards what the public would accept. Right after this, you have the dispatch to Cambodia, which was called peacekeeping, but was really humanitarian relief and reconstruction. In short, the SDF was doing in Iraq what they're most popular for doing in Japan after a disaster, for example. Now let's move on and talk about opinion polls and the SDF dispatch to Iraq. This is an interesting question. I often hear elites, people in the defense ministry, for example, say that the dispatch was in fact well supported. And this slide and next slide, I'm going to suggest it's not quite, that's not actually quite the case. Now here what we see is actually ambivalence. I mean, you had slight dominance of support in February 2004, then it became more, you got more opposition in March. But basically you had pretty much a tie in terms of the answer to this question. Do you support the dispatch of the SDF to Iraq? But on the other hand, when asked, and I'm sorry, the formatting's off a little bit here. This is December 2005, December 2004, and November 2004. When asked, do you support extending the SDF mission for another year? As you can see, the picture was quite different. You had a clear majority rising to a very large majority saying no, they did not want to see it extended. Now, how do we explain these two? I would argue that the dispatch of the SDF, and this mostly focused on the dispatch of the ground self-defense forces to Samoa, was all about humanitarian reconstruction and relief. They were purifying water, they were repairing schools, they were building roads, they were doing all these kinds of good things. Very much like what they were doing in Cambodia. I would say this was basically the Cambodia paradigm extended to Iraq, with only a very few minor differences. We can talk more about that later. And as I say, the SDF over the years has become very popular, first and foremost because of disaster relief operations in Japan. So my understanding of this is that the public likes what the SDF and particularly the GSDF was doing in Samoa. They just didn't want them to stay there any longer. They thought it was a dangerous place. They thought it was too close to a war. So they were saying, we like what the GSDF is doing in Iraq, but we want them to leave. Now, overwhelming support for the SDF deployment in the end. Did that happen? In September 2006, and by the way, there was a similar Yomiuri poll as well, the Prime Minister's office asked about this dispatch to Iraq 2 months after the GSDF troops had been withdrawn. It found nearly 72%, well over 70%, favorably or strongly or somewhat favorably evaluated the deployment, whereas less than 20% negatively evaluated. So you can say great success, the public was convinced in the end. Again, another fait accompli is successful. But I think this actually shows only the public's tendency to support SDF humanitarian and reconstruction missions, not this deployment itself. And the two should not be confused. The original, the question that they used prompted respondents by saying, you know, the GSDF went to Iraq, they built roads and bridges and purified water and repaired schools, etc. They suffered no casualties and they've withdrawn. Do you support what they did? And, you know, in a way it's hard not to. I mean, who doesn't like purifying water and repairing schools? You know, you almost have to be a misanthrope to say no, or you have to answer strategically. If you're a strategic poll answerer, and of course the pollsters don't like people like that, you will understand that if you say, yes, I think they did a great job, that this may be interpreted as supporting the overall deployment. But if you answer sincerely, you're very likely to fit into the 71% plus. Also, of course, the question avoided Koizumi's original justification for the deployment, i.e. To strengthen the U.S. alliance, to prevent to ensure that the U.S. not abandon Japan by being a loyal ally, and also this kind of normal nation justification that Japan has to start playing a security role, a military role in international politics. That he made this argument when he announced the dispatch in December of 2005. So again, it's kind of, it's hard to be against these activities. But this is again a case of, getting a result based on the way you word the question. By wording the question in this way, it had, I think, a big impact on the outcome. But this should not, and because of that, or despite that, of course, later this was represented as the public endorsement of the overall policy in its totality. And I know Japanese government bureaucrats who continue to believe that. And I think actually one problem, this is a case of kind of trying to manufacture public opinion. But one problem with it, which we'll see in a moment, is that actually the people who are doing this may end up fooling themselves and may exaggerate the extent to which they have enjoyed public support, and it may cause them to overreach. Now, interestingly, one other thing. Actually, this 72%, which is a huge majority, actually represents a significant decline from previous polls before Iraq that showed, in answer to a different but more general question, do you support the SDF engaging in humanitarian relief and reconstruction overseas, 85% supporting that. So actually, this still shows a significant drop, and I would argue this is part of what I would call the Koizumi syndrome or the Iraq syndrome. Namely, you actually see a reduced willingness after Iraq to send the SDF overseas for any purpose. Now, also, of course, what's interesting about this question is the previous survey did not ask about the ongoing ASDF deployment to Iraq. The ASDF was also deployed to provide logistical support for coalition forces. It was also non-combat. It was very low-key. They did not ask about that, and one reason might be because they had a good idea they would hear an answer they didn't like. They did ask another question about the ASDF deployment, the Prime Minister's Office survey. They did not ask, do you support it, the ASDF deployment? They asked, have you heard of it? And they found barely more than 50%, like 52% answered yes. And you can look at that result and easily think that it helped them to test whether they could have, in effect, what I would call a flying under the radar strategy with that deployment, which is if you keep it low key and you don't talk about it, nobody notices, even though there's significant public opposition, you can continue it without big political costs. That, I think, was their strategy, and I think that question tends to support that view. Of course, that's also somewhat dangerous if a plane is shot down or something, then you have a very sharp public backlash. And, again, to think about what's in the news now, it's a little bit like nuclear safety. As long as nothing goes wrong, you don't have to worry, but if you say it's safe and then something goes wrong, then you have a huge backlash. So again, June 2006, 55% opposed continuing the mission versus 33% who supported. And by March 2007, this was approaching 70% opposing the deployment versus less than 20% who supported. That's a pretty lopsided majority. And also, in terms of the more general question, should Japan be cooperating with the U.S. in Iraq? By about the same margin, you have respondents saying no. So you see an increasingly negative view of the ASDF deployment, reaching very high numbers. Now, just before the upper house election, by the way, the Diet extended this mission. I believe it was for another 2 years. So they had to take that unpopular vote, the LDP, and of course the opposition Democrats opposed it fairly close to the election. And that, although we don't have any polls that ask if that mattered, that may have also contributed to the LDP's defeat in the following election. But what we can say, I think with more certainty, is that even if the public was not voting against the ASDF in Iraq per se, or constitutional reform per se, which Abe was pushing very hard during this period, it was voting against Abe's priorities in these areas, and voting against those priorities, and they wanted to focus on these other domestic economic insecurity. In fact, Abe wanted to focus on foreign security issues, the public wanted to focus on domestic security issues. As we can see, of course, the pension scandal was a big issue here. I don't write about this so much in this book. I have another manuscript where I trace public concern about the pension system back to 2003. And pretty much from 2003 onwards, it was the public's top priority. And Koizumi ignored this and sort of handed his successor a ticking time bomb, politically speaking. And as such, the scandal over lost pension records was just the catalyst for very deep underlying angst about this issue. And in January 2007, we can see here a near majority, a large plurality, said they thought it was inappropriate to have discussions about constitutional reform in the upcoming election, again suggesting the public didn't want to focus on that topic, they had other priorities. Now, the lessons that politicians drew from the election, and this is also important because you know, you can only know as much about public opinion as you survey, right? And it depends on the questions you ask, you know, how many times, when you ask them, etc. So there's always some room to interpret what the public actually thinks based on the snapshots of public opinion you take. But there's another layer here too, which is what message do politicians get? And it's very clear they got the message that the public did not want constitutional reform, did not want to reclaim the right to collective self-defense, and did not want more international activism and SDF deployments overseas. They rather wanted this focus on domestic economic concerns. We can see Kome sternly warned Abe about this. Former Prime Minister Aso in 2009, when he was Prime Minister, many people thought he would reinterpret the Constitution to allow for the right of collective self-defense. He was a hawk, he was on record supporting this, but he basically said, he came out, I found a quote from him in which he basically said he abandoned this because of what happened in the 2007 election. He interpreted this as a defeat for them. And here again, House of Councilor members supporting constitutional reform. 71% in 2004 drops down to 53% in 2007. The Asahi poll of council members, Yomiuri found essentially the same thing. So the politicians got the message and they started to change policy. Nonetheless, you do have, they didn't give in on everything, of course. We have this, we have the MSDF deployment ongoing, which I'll get to in a moment. But let me say a little bit more here about support for constitutional reform. Here you have support, which peaks about 2004 and then starts to go down. I would argue this is due to Iraq. And then here we have accelerated decline in support. This is, and also we have accelerated growth in opposition to reforming the Constitution. This is precisely when Prime Minister Abe was talking about and was banging the drum for constitutional reform. So his campaign was clearly counterproductive for that cause. And then by the time Fukuda's in office, 2008, you have for the first time a plurality of 1% within the margin of error, saying that they opposed constitutional reform. Now we have a bit of a bounce back in 2009 with the bare majority saying yes, we support constitutional reform, but then last year we're basically back at tie again. So basically, this is kind of where the public is. It's you pretty much have a tie for and against constitutional reform. Now, interesting question. What are the results for 2011? The result is nothing, because Yomiuri didn't do a survey this year. Now, it might well be that because of the earthquake, they just decided to put it off. Although you'd think if it were really such a national priority, they would do it anyway. It may have been an excuse. I think one reason they decided not to do it was because they understood that the results would not be very encouraging. In fact, I actually don't know if they didn't do it. They might have not done it. They might have done it and just decided not to publish it. By the way, that's a fascinating future topic for someone to look at is the Prime Minister's office polling. They have this whole polling organization there that does, I cited their poll earlier, that does polling. This goes back to the 1960s. They have really interesting, detailed questions about the SDF, such as, okay, well, you think the SDF is mostly useful for disaster relief, but you think they should also be preparing for a war? Those sorts of detailed questions they ask. Another interesting question, I don't know if I'll ever be allowed to find out the answer to this, is whether they ask questions, get answers they don't like, and then just bury it. I don't know, but it's something to think about. Now, support for revising Article 9, of course, was much lower than support for constitutional revision overall, with support peaking at around 44%, lower in Asaki, and then the highest opposition was around 77%. By the way, this is a mistake. This is revision of Article 9, not constitutional revision. So basically, our advocates of constitutional reform now have to start from scratch. You had the launch of constitutional reform by Yomiuri Shimbun in 1993, and basically public support has returned to the level it started at in 1993. You had a big buildup in support, and now you're back at the beginning. Now, what I mentioned earlier, the extending the MSDF refueling mission in fall 2007, Abe and then Fukuda were determined to do this, even though Fukuda, of course, moved away from a lot of the hawkish policies of his predecessors and was generally more interested in economics, in economic issues. Nonetheless, he continued to pledge. And what we see here, we see opposition to extension, and we see support for extension. They sort of tie here for a while, and then opposition reemerges as dominant. What happened here? First, we had Fukuda scrap the old bill and write a new bill that was much more limited, that limited the size of deployment, got rid of things like search and rescue and sending the GSDF to Pakistan, which was in the original bill, and basically tried to water it down to gain public support. This had some effect. Also, around this time, we have the discussion about a grand coalition between the DPJ and the LDP. It turns out the public did not support that. However, polling consistently shows the public wants the two parties to get along and to cooperate and not fight with each other. And if you look at polls in the United States too, there's no bigger turnoff for Americans than members of Congress shouting at each other. And it's the same thing in Japan, as much or even more so. So when you had what appeared to be more cooperation, I would argue that helped to influence, to help increase support. But then, of course, that fell apart, and then something else really big happened, which is Prime Minister Fukuda, who was not known for his misstatements, or shitsugen, made one that had a big impact. He basically said, we didn't promise to clean up the pension mess by next April, even though they had the missing pension records. So he obviously forgot for a moment. There was a strong reaction to that. His cabinet's approval ratings dropped about 10% right after that, and support for this also dropped. And again, I would say this gets back to the issue of priorities. I think the public heard that, saw all the effort he was putting into this issue, and decided that he did not share their priorities, and that he was more interested in this mission than in dealing with pension reform. Consequently, support for this, and for him too, plummeted about that time. Now, public support, on the other hand, I've talked so far about overseas deployments of the SDF. But now let's talk about public support for territorial defense. It's strong and growing. You can see here these are Prime Minister's office polls showing a strong majority supporting missile defense versus only about a quarter who oppose missile defense, and less than 10% of those strongly. So, this is pretty solid evidence. And then even in 2009, the ASO cabinet decided, of course, to deploy missile defenses for the first time during a North Korean missile test in case it happened to fall in Japan. And here we see, of course, nearly 3/4 of Japanese supported this decision, with only about 16% opposing. So this is, I would suggest, overwhelming evidence in favor, or suggest overwhelming support for missile defense. We can also see this in support for the buildup of the Coast Guard to defend against ships intruding into Japanese waters, the North Korean spy ships, and more recently, of course, the Chinese fishing boat. So my argument is, in some sense, Japan is becoming a normal country, or maybe always was at one level, in terms of public support for territorial defense. Now, how does public opinion relate to the new DPJ administration in terms of security? I would argue the clash between the public and the LDP's promotion of force approaching SDF deployments overseas, particularly during Koizumi and Abe administrations, it's largely dissipated. That clash, that confrontation is no longer there because the DPJ's policies are much closer to public opinion on this issue. The DPJ is pursuing a defensive realist grand strategy that focuses on territorial defense, building up Japan's submarine fleet, deploying Japanese troops to the Nansei Islands, the southwestern islands between Okinawa and Taiwan, and avoiding overseas deployments related to the use of force, especially those related to U.S. conflicts such as Afghanistan, such as that we talk about later. Now, as we can see here, a plurality growing into a majority supported Hatoyama's decision to withdraw the MSDF refueling mission from the Indian Ocean in January 2010. By the way, how much time do I actually have?
Maybe you can finish up about another 5 minutes.
Okay, good.
Then we'll do this.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'm pretty much on track then, and I'll just move on from that one then. Now, one counter-argument you can make, and that's why I thought it was worth addressing, is Japan's counter-piracy deployment to the Indian Ocean inconsistent with the public's defensive realism? My argument would be basically no. The reason is this is really a high seas deployment. It's not an overseas projection of military power on foreign soil. Now, there's kind of a slight exception to that. There are P-3C patrol planes that are based at an American French air base in Djibouti and that fly patrol missions from there. And some talk, Japan recently rented a piece of land there and built its own facility. Some talk about this as Japan's first overseas base. That's not true, by the way. Japan has had many other overseas bases, such as in Iraq, Kuwait, Cambodia, etc. But leaving that aside, that's of course a facility on friendly soil. It's not a military operation per se there. But Japan's policy has in practice been to avoid combat in practice in this operation. So this is actually a non-combat mission. Now it doesn't have to be. In theory, they might get involved in combat if some pirates are foolish enough to basically attack them or attack a ship under their custody, that they're escorting. But other countries, for example, that send destroyers there within months, like Norway sent a single destroyer within 3 months, they'd already had a firefight with pirates. The SDF has been there for, over 2 years now, never a firefight. Now this mission is also politically neutral because it's an extremely broad coalition. China's there, Russia's there. How many people know that Iran is part of this coalition? So, everyone except North Korea, basically. So, and maybe they would like to. So it's so politically neutral that, again, it kind of, it takes sucks the controversy out of it. There's no danger of kind of entrapment in U.S. military operations. This is one of the few, perhaps the only naval operation in recent history in which it's not U.S.-centric. In fact, the U.S. does not have a big presence there often. And the U.S. Navy isn't really interested in this. They have other things they'd rather be doing. And we do see, in fact, a plurality supporting this, almost 50%. By the way, one other thing that I allude to in my book, I think in a footnote, it's also possible that, in general, high seas deployments, naval deployments, are somewhat more acceptable to the public than troops on the ground in other countries, particularly in countries where there's combat underway. And I think if you look at American public opinion or other Western countries, you find something similar. It's easier to send the Navy onto the high seas than it is to send troops into foreign countries. Continued growth for support of territorial defense. We're about at the end here. This is an MTV poll from, as you can see, from 2010. Asking how the Khan cabinet should respond to the situation around the Senkaku Islands following that fishing vessels altercation with the Coast Guard vessels. And the results are on the next slide. Now what's interesting here is, strengthen security of patrol vessels by using the Japanese Coast Guard, about over 30%. Then you have two answers that involves dispatching the MSDF, either by sending destroyers down there to guard against fishing vessels, or sending the SDF to the GSDF and actually deploying them on the Senkaku Islands. Of course, the Senkaku Islands have nobody living on them now. And that's over 40%. And if you add this, you get over 70% wanting to make a physical response, military force or police force, to strengthen Japan's control in the area. By contrast, 1.4% increase insertions that the islands are Japanese territory. I saw a Communist Party poster in Kobe a couple months ago that said, "We assert the islands are Japanese more than any other party does." Well, that's probably not going to buy you many votes here. Talk with China, 1.2%, almost within the margin of error. That tells you that Japanese don't put much faith in talking to China about this, and that we can see a pretty solid majority in favor of taking, using some kind of physical force to maintain control of the islands. Again, I think this suggests, as I say, that support for national defense, territorial defense, is very robust in Japan. So again, due to the public's attitudinal defense of realism, don't expect the SDF to engage in overseas combat. Don't expect them to deploy even in non-combat missions in U.S.-centric military operations overseas. The Khan cabinet has been approaching this possibility to some extent in Afghanistan by perhaps sending 10 doctors to Afghanistan, but that seems to be stuck. Expect Japan to continue developing a more robust territorial defense, more submarines, more troops on the outlying islands. Expect some scope for Japan to expand its role in peace building, post-conflict reconstruction, and counter-piracy operations to some extent. Now this is something that I've been working on in another project. This isn't in my book. I'll just mention the possibility of the EU as a possible new partner for peace building, since both countries take an essentially non-kind of combat approach to peace building, peacekeeping operations. And also the EU is playing a leading role in counter-piracy efforts off of East Africa. So there's actually a possibility for Japan to join EU NAVFOR now that Norway, which is not a member of the EU, has already joined. And also, the EU is a good partner because they share values. They're both liberal values of liberal democracy. The EU is the broadest international organization outside of the UN, but yet again, it's very much like-minded with Japan. No entrapment fears, lack of large power asymmetries, and I would argue in some ways the EU can help Japan build a broad domestic coalition for greater activism in these areas, and that's maybe the final point. One lesson of the Koizumi period is narrow winning coalitions in favor of overseas dispatch or other security policies are not sustainable. If you want to have a sustainable policy for overseas dispatch of the SDF or most other security policies, you need a much broader coalition than the coalition that Koizumi built. Otherwise, the opposition will exploit public opposition to it, and the policy will ultimately fail. Now here, and that means, obviously the two major parties, but if you can, maybe even going beyond the two major parties. We know that the Social Democrats have been very influential, have had some real political power under the DPJ administration. So maybe you have to reach out to the leftists, the left Democrats, and the Social Democrats to build a really reliable coalition. And actually the EU can help with that because you have lots of Social Democrats in the EU who advocate, these kinds of deployments overseas, even more than this. So, and if the Social Democrats want to talk, and you're in Japan want to talk to their counterparts, who do they call in the U.S.? Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, that's the only socialist. But there are lots of people they can call in Europe, actually. So, in that sense, Japan, the EU might be particularly well placed to help build this consensus. Thank you for listening. Look forward to your questions. Thanks very much, Paul.
so we do have some time for questions now. So please, if you could stand up and just state your name and affiliation, and then please ask Paul. So, yeah.
My name is Larry Rapetta. I teach at Meiji University. Okay. And I thank you for really a very fascinating presentation. You managed to make the whole presentation without addressing what public opinion might be concerning the presence of American military forces in Japan. And I assume that there's very broad support. If so, it would appear to be a contradiction. On one hand, you have public support for American military presence here. On the other hand, you have opposition to becoming entrapped in these adventures abroad. How do you deal with that?
Okay. Yes, I didn't talk about perceptions about the U.S. military presence in Japan in my talk. I don't really talk about it even so much in my book, particularly regarding bases. I do talk about and discuss and present evidence regarding views of the alliance. It might seem contradictory, although in another way, maybe not. I mean, there's very strong support for the U.S. alliance. It's now, I think, up around 70% plus. So Japanese like the alliance. They like the fact that the U.S. Is helping to defend Japan. But on the other hand, they don't want to get entrapped in American wars that they think are foolish, and they don't think are in serve Japan's national interests. And maybe that's selfish. On the other hand, this is what a kind of self-regarding country or public might want. Get as much benefit as possible and avoid the pitfalls. Now you can also call it. Now a critic can call that, of course, free riding. But if you call it free riding, then the question becomes: is there actually common interest? Free riding implies you're getting benefit, but you're not paying the costs. So, the U.S. Invades Iraq. Is Japan getting benefit or not? That becomes the key question. If they are, not sending troops is free riding. If they're not, then not sending troops is avoiding entrapment. That's how I look at that. So again, very strong support for the alliance, but concern about cooperating with the U.S. in some areas, such as these overseas conflicts that are far from Japan, and of course not really covered in the original alliance. The original alliance is really all about defense of Japan. It doesn't say anything about a global alliance in various parts of the world. Again, I don't look at base issues. I'm encouraging an MA student to look at that right now. But obviously, that's often more at the local level anyway, in terms of the political impact. I can say a little bit about Futenma, which I think I addressed in a footnote, which is that the public is actually was not necessarily opposed, and I would argue on balance was open to Hatoyama's ideas about revisiting the Nago plan. But the problem was, of course, he changed his mind every 10 minutes, it seemed. And so you never really got a stable policy on that. And in the end, the whole thing just kind of collapsed because it was so badly mismanaged. I hope that answers your question.
Sure, I guess a non-critic might respond to that possible contradiction by saying it's common sense. And
yeah.
Maybe it's a powerful message that could be better delivered to the Americans.
It could be. Of course, part of the problem is then this becomes very controversial because, as I say, is America acting in other countries' interests or not? Americans and American policymakers will insist, yes. But others will sometimes obviously disagree, and how far do you want to push that kind of confrontation? But yeah, I agree, and in fact that's one reason why I wrote the book, to kind of send this message actually.
There was a question in the back.
Yeah.
Please state your name and affiliation.
Toshiosu, the businessman. My question or my awareness of the issue is that the Japanese people are not so much concerned about the policies, 政策, rather they are interested in political games, 政局, and it seems that this is a trend of both politicians as well as citizens. Then, if you have any idea or view or comments on my awareness, I'd like to hear your.
But I mean, what you're saying is people are more interested in political fighting and scandals than they are in policy.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'd respond by saying I think the media is more interested in political scandals than in policy. I'm not sure that's true of the public. I think if you look at the public's deep distrust of politicians in Japan, by the way, this is something the U.S. and Japan have in common. deep disappointment over the DPJ, etc. A lot of it boils down to I think, disgust at this kind of the political games we're seeing. Now, I can see some of that in the polling, as I say. The public is consistently wants the parties to cooperate and is not interested in seeing fighting between the parties too much. So there's that. That's one indicator. And again, I think the more that you get these scandals and this infighting, the more distrust of politicians increases, or the more the distrust of the ruling party increases, in this case now the Democrats. So I actually think the public longs for something else. But, given the kind of media culture Japan is in, and the U.S. too, for that matter, it's hard to extricate themselves from the situation. And it's certainly true that in the media, scandal often sells better than policy.
Yes, please.
Sakamoto, Japan Forum on International Relations. My question is, following that question, if the U.S. announced withdrawal of U.S. force from Japan, what's the impact on Japan?
Okay.
They will reform the constitution, what the impact?
That last part is particularly interesting. Will they reform the Constitution? I personally would say no, because there's no need to. The Constitution allows Japan to do a lot already. Why do they need to change the Constitution? And in fact, as I see it, really constitutional reform now mostly comes down to fighting overseas, sending the military overseas.
But if U.S. withdraw,
Yeah.
you have a threat, you see.
Yeah, if the U.S. withdraws, then Japan will build up its military, but it will be within the Constitution, is my point. Japan could, double its military budget. It could build up its Air Force, its Navy. I don't see that's, under the current interpretation, I think that's perfectly constitutional. So I don't see any problem with that. Now, if it came, depending how far Japan went in terms of offensive strike capabilities, it might become unconstitutional. On the other hand, Japan now has in-air refueling capabilities for its Air Force. That has been seen as an offensive capability, but that's been considered constitutional. It's even been argued in the past by the government that holding nuclear weapons would be constitutional. So I don't really see that. The only place I think the Constitution really becomes a barrier is overseas dispatch. Maybe you could say responding to, say, a North Korean attack by hitting North Korean bases, for example, or Chinese bases. But even there, I don't think so. My understanding is once Japan's attacked, then they can get back. Now, if you wanted to talk about preemption, maybe that would be constitutional, maybe it wouldn't. Certainly, I would argue under the current Constitution, preventive war, such as we had in Iraq, that's not preemption, it's preventive war, would not be constitutional. But otherwise, I think it's not clear to me you really need to change the Constitution. Since Japan is already engaged in defending itself, I would argue most of Japan's territorial defense it already does. Now that China is beginning to build up its Navy and its Air Force, it's beginning to challenge Japanese air dominance in the East China Sea around Okinawa. But up until now, China was not in any position to compete with Japan militarily in that area. This is something new. But again, the broader question, the U.S. pulls out, I would see Japan probably increasing its defense budget. Another question would be, would they try to realign with China? I don't know. It would depend on the relationship and how China is perceived at that time. But if not, I would see Japan spending more on its defense, maybe developing nuclear weapons at some point. I don't know. On the other hand, I'd also make the point that actually we're beginning to leave the nuclear age, because not only missile defense, but also precision strikes. You now have conventional weapons that can take out hardened silos where nuclear weapons are. So actually, you can attack nuclear weapons with non-nuclear weapons now, which you couldn't do 20, 30 years ago.
Sam James with the Young Research Institute. My feeling, which is totally not based on public opinion surveys, is that there wasn't any support for the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty because Japanese saw it as keeping Japan from recognizing China. In other words, the Dobun Doshu, the same race, the same people, and the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was preventing this. And then when it became possible to have cheese and eat it at the same time, in other words, the U.S.-Japan Treaty and relations with China, at that point, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty got support. We remember there was a period all throughout the 60s that when 1970 came, you were able to abandon the treaty, revise it, and so forth, but the answer would be that they would get rid of it. But in 1970, that was very close to 2 years later when diplomatic relations were in fact established with China, and the mood was very much moving in that direction. But I had not seen any polls on that. Have you seen any polls on that?
No, not on that question. And you see, this is of course the problem. We have all these interesting conjectures. We'd love to put them in a poll question and ask, but we often don't have the resources to do so. I think that's a very plausible hypothesis in the sense, in a couple of ways. First, we know normalization of relations with China, mainland China, communist China, was very popular from the left, of course, but all the way to the right as well. It was very popular at the time. But the other problem, of course, is this also is going on at the same time as the Vietnam War, and the U.S. starts to draw down. The U.S. pulls out of Vietnam and starts to draw down its forces in Asia. I would argue from around 75, with the completion of the U.S. withdrawal, you begin to have a shift from fear of entrapment to fear of abandonment. And that's when Japan begins to up its military cooperation. We begin to negotiate the first U.S.-Japan defense guidelines in 1975 that were put in 1978. So I would see that as a key issue. But I would agree, it's quite possible that the fact that Japan was able to normalize relations with China did help to increase support for the alliance. The only thing I would wonder about, though, is it's not clear to me in 1970 that it was really known that the relations with China were about to be established. Of course, the U.S. had this clear policy of non-recognition. As we know, Henry Kissinger made this secret visit to China in '71, and the U.S. announced that Nixon was going to China, and Sato was shocked and taken aback. So I wonder if how much of it really was in the air. Of course, you were here, I wasn't, so I don't know. But otherwise, I think, yeah, that probably did help to increase support. Also, of course, another thing related to that is China stopped opposing the alliance. China consistently criticized the alliance up to 1972, and you read Kissinger's memoirs and Nixon's memoirs, and they used the cap in the bottle argument to mollify China. They, Kissinger, Chou En-lai talks about the wild horse of China, and basically Kissinger and Nixon say, you don't want the alliance to end because we can control Japan and keep it from becoming a threat to you. And eventually they buy that. And from 1972 until the revised guidelines in 1997, basically all criticism of the alliance ceases. So that also, I think, helps, the fact that China is no longer an opponent of the alliance.
Yeah,
I was just wondering, if the Japanese increases its defense within, with the changing the constitution, what would happen to U.S. military bases? Would they kick them out because their defenses have gotten greater, or would they continue their alliance with the U.S.?
Okay, so if Japan changes its constitution and then increases its defense, would that prompt Japan then to kick U.S. bases out of Japan? Well, as I said, first of all, I don't see that happening anytime soon. As I also said, I also think that Japan can increase its defense a lot without changing the constitution at all. But for example, you have this 1% limit of defense spending, that Japan was going to limit its defense spending to 1% GDP. That's nothing to do with the constitution. That was a policy adopted in the 1970s. Nakasone abandoned it. Japan's defense spending was slightly above 1% for 2 years. and then it went back down, and it's never gone back above 1%. But that's nothing to do with the Constitution. Japan could increase it above 1% if it wanted to. If Japan became totally self-sufficient in its defense, yeah, they might want to kick out U.S. bases. But I don't think that would be a difficult thing to do. It would be very expensive. Of course, Japan is a different financial situation. And, you know, the interests of the two sides are reasonably compatible. And of course, Hatoyama was basically arguing, I mean, he was very inconsistent in policies, but I think he did have a fairly clear vision, which is consolidation and some reduction of U.S. bases. Ozawa talked about the same thing as well. And in places like Nago, that makes a lot of sense. And it's too bad that they weren't able to negotiate something with the United States. And now it looks like the U.S. is rethinking the whole thing as well. So I would see pressure, and we'll continue to see some pressure to consolidate and reduce bases, to reduce the kind of the trouble that bases supposedly do or perceive to cause to their local communities. But I don't see Japan going much beyond that. Now again, if the alliance were to end, and if, for example, Japan were to align with China, one interesting difference is that China probably would not need or want military bases in Japan. So that would actually, if you wanted to compare the costs of the two sides of aligning with Japan, with the U.S. versus China, that would be one less cost of aligning with Japan. Of course, with China, of course, there would be potentially other costs, maybe big costs with aligning with them, on the other hand. But yeah, I don't see that happening, in short.
Doctor, thank you very much for your wonderful seminar. I've been very impressed. There is one thing as an ordinary citizen I'd like to point out, which is about the manipulation of the public poll carried out by the Japanese papers, I think. For instance, I one time subscribed to Asahi Shimbun and their public poll, of course, against the Article 9 of the matters, but those are the topics that they normally do not talk. Particularly the mission to the Middle East, and all these matters totally neglected. The presence of the self-defense itself is totally neglected in the daily, articles. So I think it's very dangerous to rely on what we think as a general to think about the defense issues. But good news is that since the beginning of Hatoyama inauguration, lots of things regarding about the Japanese military or defense policies matters increasing a lot. Particularly the great one is Senkaku, and then therefore that's the awakening stage for the ordinary citizen like myself. All right, Jesus, China is increasing its military power, and aircraft carrier will be deployed to the South China Sea, which is the core center of the crude important oil to Japan after the replacement of atomic power. So all these things will be, I think, focusing the point for or amongst the Japanese people, so that is the reason why perhaps Asahi Shimbun is delaying the public poll, because they will get the negative views or positive views from the Japanese side.
Okay. Interesting point. I find their polling reasonably fair, certainly as fair as Yomiuri. Now, they do have their biases. I think their Article 9 question is somewhat biased towards people saying they want to keep Article 9 in terms of wording. But, I also think Asahi Shimbun has changed over time. For example, up until 2002, they opposed the SDF going overseas for disaster relief and humanitarian operations and peace building. But in September 2002, they changed and came out in favor of those. And in fact, this is an interesting point because I see a new politics of overseas dispatch. I talk about this in the conclusion of my book a bit, which is it's no longer Asahi is against overseas dispatch. Now, actually, sometimes they're the main proponent. Here's an example, Sudan. In summer of 2008, Japan announced it was sending the Jiatai to Sudan. How many? 2 members to work in headquarters. Asahi published an op-ed saying, this is not sufficient. Japan needs to send more SDF to this UN mission. What did Yomiuri do? They did not send, they did not have any editorial about this, they ignored it. But there was an article in Yomiuri that basically quoted Defense Ministry officials as saying they weren't really interested in the mission because they're more interested in US-centric missions. So if you're a hawk, you want to expand the role of the SDF, maybe get it involved in use of force overseas. You know, you want to go with a US-centered type of deployment in Afghanistan or Iraq. Before, of course, you know, for hawks as well, the UN peacekeeping missions were useful for kind of expanding the precedent for sending the SDF overseas and approaching possibly military force. But I think for them, it's now outlived that usefulness, so they don't need it anymore. Another case, by the way, interesting, under Koizumi, you had a peace process in Aceh. Now, during the tsunami, you had 1,000 Japanese SDF members go to Aceh. They performed a lot of disaster relief, then they left. Then Finland and the EU brokered a peace agreement there. Japan had been trying before. And then you had a UN ASEAN force go there to monitor it. Japan sent nobody. They could have. They would have needed a new special law to do it. But they could have done that. And that would have been an interesting example of activism. Asahi even ignored that, but I think they ignored it just because they were not kind of intellectually engaged in the issue and didn't know what was going on. That's another limitation sometimes. But and that's actually another problem, because Japan has this, you know, you don't have a permanent law. Every time you send the SDF overseas, if it's not pure disaster relief or UN peacekeeping, you need to have a special law. Now, Yomiuri and those on the right want this law. Those on the left are opposed to it because they're afraid it's going to lead to entrapment in American wars. It'll become too easy to send troops to Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever. But a consequence of that is that when you have a real peace-building mission like Aceh, Japan can't, it's too hard to participate, because you have to pass a special law just to do it. And one other thing, it may be that Asahi and Yomiuri and these other have their own biased view, and as you say, they influence the public in a certain way, and maybe people in the public don't have a balanced view as a result. But if nothing else, they balance each other out. So you have Yomiuri and Asahi balancing each other out. And again, the point is collective public opinion. You know, you have pacifists and hawks canceling each other out, and you get a more moderate policy as a result.
Just take a couple more questions. Okay, yeah, please.
Gabriel Shepard, Embassy of Hungary.
Okay.
I like your conclusion. You're saying
Which one? This one?
EU is a natural security partner of life for Japan, but my question is then why has Japan been quite reluctant to get politically engaged with the EU? Because if you look back at the history of the EU-Japan summits, it's always the EU that has been more proactive or pushing for political cooperation, while on the other hand, Japan has been more like focusing solely on the trade or economic side of the
Okay, that's an interesting point. I've actually just finished an article kind of on this topic. For those of you who don't know the EU-Japan relationship, you had a 10-year action plan in 2001 that called for cooperation in economics, culture, and security cooperation. And after 10 years, it's obvious nothing was achieved. Very little was achieved. And actually, I've been working with an organization in Europe that's been advising the EU and Japan on how to fix this and counter piracy and post-conflict reconstruction, what we're talking about. I'm not sure I would necessarily agree that Japan is not interested in that. Both sides tended to neglect this, I think, both in Brussels and in Tokyo. Now, Japan is focused on economics, but that's very recently, because, of course, the EU and Korea had this FTA. Now Japanese companies are very worried that that's going to put them at a big disadvantage in Europe. So they want an FTA. They're really clamoring for it. But EU side doesn't see much benefit, so you have kind of a bit of a log jam or a deadlock there at the moment. But I see you know, interest in Japan in this. And I can see, you know, and in fact, we are seeing some greater cooperation. There's cooperation between the EU and Japan in building a police training center in Afghanistan. They're running a joint seminar in Tajikistan and for Central Asian countries for border control. They're also doing some cooperation, actually are doing some cooperation off Somalia. So I think there is some interest in the Japan side. Again, there may be a more general issue of how to get Japan engaged in peace building in Aceh or Mindanao, etc. Japan has shown more interest, but it kind of waxes and wanes according to domestic politics in Japan. But I would say that Japan is actually potentially very interested in that.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, so Paul, just to kind of finish up the talk. So what I think the really great contribution too is that a lot of scholars of Japanese politics rarely look at public opinion as an important variable. I mean, if you read the work of some of the most important Japan scholars, T.J. Temple, Alice Krauss, they don't really talk about public opinion very much. So I mean, I think the main thing Paul's work is basically arguing that public opinion in Japan actually matters. And especially in the foreign policy realm, a lot of scholars tend to not pay much attention to it. So Paul also has, what's your previous book with Eldridge?
Oh, okay.
War on Terror?
I co-edited a volume with Robert Eldridge entitled Japanese Public Opinion on the War on Terror. And actually, before that, I had a small paper with the East-West Center's public policy series, or policy studies series, which was also entitled Japanese Public Opinion on the War on Terror, but then it had a subtitle, Implications for Policy.
Yeah, so
that one you can download for free, actually.
Yeah, so if you're interested in public opinion as an important variable, if you think that, because a lot of the new arguments are that with Japan's new kind of two-party system, public opinion is going to matter more. This is Francis Rosen's argument, of course, in the recent book. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone.